I'd like to call this Congressional Appropriations Committee meeting to order. First item on the agenda is roll call.
Congressman Walker?
Here.
Congressman Bighorse?
Here.
Congresswoman Stabler?
Present.
Congresswoman Whitehorn?
Here.
Congresswoman Edwards? Congressman Potts?
Here. Next item on the agenda is prayer. Congressman Walker.
Dear Heavenly Father, just come to you again this afternoon and ask that you be with us as we deliberate and move towards making decisions that hopefully make this government easier to work with and easier to understand for those that follow, Lord, and those that we serve. Lord, I just thank you for the pretty weather. Thank you for all of the rain. Lord, I just thank you for this June month, special time of the year for us, and I appreciate that. Lord, I just want to say a special prayer for Coach Atterbury. He's been dealing with cancer, and he went through his last chemo treatments, Lord, and I just ask that you heal him from the cancers that are ravaging his body, Lord. And Lord, I just want to say a special prayer for the children, elders, all men and women in uniform, Lord, like we so often pray for, but we mean it from the bottom of our hearts, Lord. And I just, again, want to ask that you please forgive us for our sins, Lord, and all these things I ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Congressman Walker. Next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. We're still working on minutes from yesterday's meeting, so at this time we do not have minutes to approve. Next item on the agenda is consideration of ONCR 1917. I'm the author. At this time, we're still working on some language and some other bills that will have an impact on both ONCR 1917 and 1915. So without objection, we'll skip over item number 5 and item number 6 on our agenda, which takes us to consideration of ONCA 1915. Congresswoman Goodfox, you are here. Are we ready to be able to talk about your bill, or would you like for us to move on to something else for a moment and come back?
No, we can talk about it. I just got the committee substitute from Congresswoman Whitehorn, so I haven't even had a chance to completely look over it. We can go over it.
Move on to consideration of ONCA 1915. Congresswoman Goodfox, you have the floor.
If Congresswoman Whitehorn can walk us through her committee substitute. That's where I'd like to start.
Congressman Walker.
I was just going to make a request that, because we've done it in both ways, I would just make a request that we hear about the committee substitute before we make a motion to approve, and then
I would prefer
do
that.
it all under discussion. I think, to me, that's my preference.
I would agree with that, and just to let everyone know, that's my preference as a committee chair. Let's hear about the committee sub before we adopt it going forward as well. Assistant Chief Redcorn.
May I have a copy, please?
I will give you the copy out of my hand.
Ms. Smurlhan, did you want to thought?
Treasurer probably needs one, too.
Ms. Smurlhan?
You already have your own copy.
Are they here and I don't see them?
Oh, should be under your agenda.
It's not with the packet, but I think I had her hand you one, but I know you were distracted.
I have it, thank you.
Excellent. Congresswoman Whitehorn, you are recognized with Congresswoman Goodfox for explanation of the committee substitute of 1950.
Well, we had a pretty in-depth discussion about, or I did. I discussed why I thought that this bill needed some changes. It was agreed to by, I think, the committee. We didn't make a motion to go ahead and draft up a committee substitute. So what this does is, what this committee substitute does is it's separate. There's a lot of different categories. Well, there's 2 different categories of property in here. So it defines both property. Osage Nation-owned property was in the original bill, but also this fund is to serve our commercial property, which I believe have two different, extremely different uses and extremely different needs for monies out of this fund. So what this committee substitute attempts to do is give that a little bit of clarity that wasn't present before. So in the purpose of the act, it designates what it's for, and to me, this fund is for doing capital improvements, regular maintenance, emergency repairs. It's responsible for expenditures for these purposes: capital improvements, regular maintenance, emergency repairs, utilities, taxes, and insurance for Osage Nation commercial properties. And then what I've heard the executive branch say, they want to use it for capital improvements on our government-owned properties. So that's what the purpose now states. Extra definitions have been added: a definition of capital improvement, a definition of commercial property, definition of Osage Nation property, a definition for regular maintenance, and a definition for emergency repairs. And yesterday, when you were looking at my amendment, Assistant Chief Redcorn, I did have net revenue in there. After working further on the bill, I decided that we didn't need to talk about that in this fund, the way it's drafted. So the establishment of the fund is in Section 3. It's named. Also, I love the idea of the Osage Nation Treasurer establishing an income account to receive lease revenues for our commercial properties. That remained in there. I think that's a very clever idea, and that was in the remaining bill. D says, is the same language, I believe. E talks about expenditures from the fund. It says expenditures from the fund are authorized for regular maintenance, emergency repairs, utilities, taxes, insurance, advertising. That was one that was asked for on all commercial property. Emergency repairs on Osage. Let me see. Advertising on all commercial property, emergency repairs on Osage Nation property. That may need a little fix. Let me see if I understand it. Emergency repairs on Osage Nation property, capital improvements on commercial property and Osage Nation property. Okay, so the reason it reads that way is I wanted it to have emergency repair capability for commercial property and emergency repair capability for Osage Nation-owned property, because in case the needs arise, we need to be able to just take it out of that emergency appropriation for it. And then it's for capital improvements on both of those types of property. And also I added pre-construction activity. It doesn't look like that that definition made it into the bill, so I might need to amend. Sorry, that's not my pen. Pre-construction activity, we have a good definition in the capital asset budget, so it's not there. So E tells how the funds can be expended and authorizes that. Then Section F talks about appropriations. It says appropriation requests for capital funding shall be accompanied by a detailed budget to include expenditure allocations directed to commercial property and Osage Nation property in each category of authorized expenditure. So above, it tells you what all the authorized expenditures are that can be spent out of the fund, and then the appropriations request needs to be designated. Which category of property are you spending this on? Commercial property or Osage Nation-owned property, which to me is important. We need to know, because all of the assets that this fund garners, other than funds appropriated out of the general treasury are going to be from earnings on those commercial properties. So it'll just give us some idea from year to year when you ask for this appropriation, how you're spending those funds when you request them. G says the property improvement fund that will be administered by the managed assets department or by its successor. I think it's important that they are active in that, and that the law says that that's who is going to be watching over our properties and our fund. H is regular language that I think was already in the bill. And then I added a section 4 on limitations. And the limitations are that expenditures out of this fund, when appropriate, have to follow the Competitive Bidding Act and the procurement policy of the Osage Nation Treasury, which I know that you're doing anyway, but the law says that. And then the other limitation is that all property serviced by this fund shall be listed on the Managed Assets Department Property Inventory document and made available to Osage Nation Congress. Ms. Rivard and I had a conversation about that yesterday, and that is something that this body has been asking for. That's an understandable document that's not just written out in legal property descriptions. I think we've got it before, but it was just written in legals, and we can't really tell anything about that. So hopefully we'll have an inventory list that kind of designates what the property is. Let me see. And then I put a severability clause in it, so if any part of the act is found unconstitutional, whatever remains will be there. So I'm open for questions. I think this, to me, in the way I read, I mean, there may be some language that needs to be changed somewhat, but the ideas are all here, how I think that the fund will work for appropriations from this body and the information we need, and give you the freedom to manage it for your purposes.
Thank you, Congresswoman Whitehorn. Just a little bit of discussion on the committee substitute. Assistant Chief.
I would defer to the treasurer, but other than some minor accommodations we would ask on the committee substitute regarding what we can spend money on. They're minor things, but they're nevertheless important. I don't have any structural or big objections to this. Others may, but I don't.
Congresswoman Good Fox.
I don't have any big objections. I do have, after we adopt the committee substitute, I will be trying to reinsert or fractionate it back into the bill, because I stated my reason yesterday. We have ethics laws. I believe in them, and I believe that we all take oaths to uphold the ethics laws, and I think that it limits us by putting full ownership. The reality is that we are, the Osage Nation is partial owner in land, and yes, it adjoins some Osages, maybe some non-Osages, but it's still fractionated land that the Osage Nation owns, and I'm going to ask the committee to place that fractionated back in there.
This time the chair will
It was taken out.
At this time, the chair will entertain motion to adopt the committee substitute. Treasurer Littleton.
Yeah, I have a question, and it was asking me yesterday, or whenever we first discussed this, and I gave you an answer concerning Section 5, the August 1 date. My brain is playing what if, and since Sarge is here, Director of Operations Johnson's here, do we have a problem if he doesn't get some project done by August 1st? Because we're talking about, 40 days, 50 days?
Treasurer Littleton, I appreciate your comments. Let's take action on adopting it before we get into discussing the details.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, I appreciate it. This time, Chair will entertain motion to adopt the committee substitute.
So moved.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the adoption of the committee substitute? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, the committee substitute is adopted. Congresswoman Whitehorn, do you have a answer or a follow-up to Treasurer Littleton's comments regarding Section 5?
Yes, I do. We can change that effective date of repeal to whatever you feel comfortable to. We can also change it all. To me, just because I saw that little glitch, and I know we might be different than an LLC, but to me, it would make sense to make the alternate effective date of this whole bill be effective October 1 and start your new fiscal year out under these practices. That's just me, but not just October 1. We can change that effective date to any day you feel comfortable with execution.
Treasurer Littleton?
I'd have to defer to me. Director of Operations. He's the property guy.
Congressman Walker? Do you have a minute?
I do. Are we past that? Okay. Okay, yeah, I've got a couple questions and are likely going to lead to some amendments. I'll start with, I've received this across the table. I was planning to make this one, but thank you. Chairman, page 2, line 82 and 83, strike managed assets department or by its successor and insert designee of the principal chief of the Osage Nation,
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Congresswoman Whitehorn?
Currently, we have the Managed Assets Department that I believe is newly formed. We've been talking about it since the SHUSO session in 2018. I believe we have a great director hired, and they're moving forward with doing, with consolidating our assets, looking at how we utilize them, the repairs that they need. And I think that is a department that is going to have some longevity and who is tasked with doing the jobs that are in this act. I did include the language or its successor. So I've been told here at the table that that's who's making the list and that's who's in charge of going out and getting the bids. And so for all intents and purposes, our Managed Assets Department is doing that task, just as we have an HR department that does our HR tasks, just as we have a Treasury department that does our Treasury tasks. So I think our law needs to indicate who's administering those functions. I do believe that also in the Capital Assets Fund, it designates someone. I don't know if that language has been taken out or not. It may have been.
We've got Assistant Chief Redcorn and then Congresswoman Good Fox. Director Johnson, did you have your hand up?
I say this with a lot of respect because we're working very well together here this week. But if the Congress can designate that that person's in charge of X responsibility, they can designate that any other person is in charge of any. So if we leave it at the chief's successor, we maintain the separation of powers between the two. Forgive me if this is a new thought from today, but that I'm pretty certain of. Yeah, thank you.
Congresswoman Good Fox.
I would, if I was on the committee and could vote, I would support the change. I think that we've seen enough changes in departments, divisions. We ourselves have gone through numerous, we've had clerk 1, clerk 2, clerk 3, receptionist, admin. I mean, we've changed it up quite a bit over here. So I think that going with what Congressman Walker and Congressman Potts were going forward is really the best way to go.
Congresswoman Whitehorn?
I don't believe that it designates a person. It designates a department that manages it. And I believe that we have, as a legislative branch, we can indicate in law who would be responsible for, as the nation sits and it has, or its successor. So somebody's going to manage our property. Somebody's going to do it. So whoever the successor of the managed assets department is, if this administration no longer wants to call it managed assets, it's in the law to give the executive branch to indicate who the successor is.
Director Johnson?
Yes, sir. I understand what you're saying, Congresswoman. That's why I thought the ambiguity of the principal chief's designee, as an example, if Mr. Halleck leaves, it's going to fall to me. I'm not his successor, but I will be the one managing all of what he was managing. So, and that gives the chief, whomever it is, whenever it is, the ability to say, okay, well, I don't like managed assets. I want to call it the building people or whatever. You're now my designee to manage these budgets. I just think that, and I'm searching for the words, vagueness of the principal chief's designee is,
Congresswoman Whitehorn?
Well, I'd just like to point out that that responsibility doesn't fall on the head of one person. It's a department or the department's successor that the principal chief also, if we strike that language, let me see, what did I do there? Hang on, I'm not this. Let me look here a minute. So the managed assets department, where is that amendment striking that? Page 1, line 41, 43?
Page 2, line
43. So were you planning on striking that at 99 and putting principal chief in there also? Because to me, this is a very important part of us being able to do the work on this appropriation bill.
Congressman Walker?
As we went through the committee substitute, I made notes, and that is something that I plan to address in a subsequent amendment, or at least discuss it.
Well,
Can I still have the floor?
Congressman Walker?
Call for the question.
There's a motion to call for the question. Is there a second? Motion to call for a question dies for lack of a second. Congressman Walker, you still have the floor.
Well, I don't want to repeat what Congresswoman Goodfuck said, but going back in the competitive bidding laws, there was all kinds of different positions and titles that were listed out that became problematic in the future. And the managed assets department is new. It could change next year. It could change 3 years from now. And it may or may not even have a successor. That may be done by someone or something different in the future. I don't have any issue with the designee of the principal chief. I'm ready to move on.
Congresswoman Whitehorn, and then we'd like to wrap this up.
Well, because this amendment relates to somewhere later in the bill, I'm interested to know how it does, and it might help my decision of how I'm going to vote on this amendment. So I know that if that's stricken, then maybe on the third page, that reference makes no sense. So that's my question. I'm not trying to be contrary.
My understanding that I've got Congressman Bighorse, I don't think that the language on page 3 would be limited by an amendment on page 2. It doesn't say that the department's never going to exist or the successor is not going to exist. But on page 3, all property serviced by this fund shall be listed on the managed asset department property inventory list. That list may always be there, but as far as who is administered by, I believe that that can be the chief's designee. That's just my understanding to where those are not tied to each other. Congressman Bighorse, and then I would like to be able to vote on the amendment.
Call for the question.
Second.
There's a motion to call for the question. There is a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Opposed, seeing none, we'll call for the question. All those in favor of the amendment to the committee substitute, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
No.
Like a roll call vote.
Congressman Walker?
Yes.
Congressman Bighorse?
Yes.
Congresswoman Stabler?
Yes.
Congresswoman Whitehorn?
No.
Congressman Potts?
Yes, the amendment passes. Still considering the committee substitute of ONC 1950. Congressman Walker.
So I'll start out with addressing what we just talked about on page 3, lines 99 and 100, where it references on the managed assets department property inventory document. I think we assume that there is such a thing. Again, to your point, Congresswoman Whitehorn, or all of our points, there may or may not be a managed assets department in the future. What's wrong with shall be listed on a managed or on a property inventory document and made available to the Osage Nation Congress? That could be made available to the Congress by the chief's designee, by the treasurer, but as long as we get a property inventory document, that's what's important to me.
Is your comment in the form of a motion to amend?
Yes, it's going to be.
Can you please prepare that in writing, Congressman
I've got,
Whitehorn?
okay. I've got it.
Well, because I think the vagueness doesn't let anyone know who specifically we are to ask for that document and who's required to keep that document. I know from talking with Ms. Revard that the managed asset department is compiling an inventory list of our property, which is very exciting news to me, because I've not seen that. So I don't know who I'm supposed to ask. Am I supposed to ask the treasurer for the list? Am I supposed to ask Mr. Johnson for the list? Who's responsible for keeping the list? To me, that just clarifies where that list is coming from. When we know a document does exist and it's being generated in a department, then that's who we ask. When we know we have payroll questions, we ask the HR department. When we have accounting questions, we ask the accounting department. I think that it needs to be a function of law.
Maybe, perhaps an amendment back to what we just amended that says the chief's designee as stated to the Congress by this date. And that maybe it can change at any time. Perhaps that's a solution. I've got Assistant Chief Redcorn, and then I've got Congressman Walker.
We just wanted to say that would be acceptable language to us. The only two people that I know the Constitution says you can apply duties to are him and me. So.
Okay. I've got Congressman Walker and then Director Johnson.
I'll yield. I'm still writing the amendment.
I just had a question, and I apologize up front for getting ready to display my ignorance. I'm a pretty simple guy, so when I read these things, I read them like an infantryman. You know, what does it say? And my question is, when you state this, you know, service by, all property serviced by this fund shall be, X by the managed asset department. Is that not the Congress telling the executive branch who will report to them? I'm just asking the question. I'm not sitting here acting like I know what's right or wrong, because I don't. Otherwise, I wouldn't ask. And that's why, to me, the vagary of the principal chief's designee for these types of things clears all of that up. So there isn't a question from somebody like me on whether or not there's a separation of powers issue or anything like that.
Right.
I mean, that is really my question.
Congressman Walker and then Congresswoman Whitehorn. Congresswoman Whitehorn.
May I suggest, Congressman Walker, since you're writing that it be that could say that the all property serviced by this fund shall be listed. All property serviced by this fund shall be listed on a property inventory document to be kept by the treasurer. That way it assures the document exists. He can tell who to make that, he can get on the chief to get him that document. And we will be assured that that document exists and we can request it of the treasurer. And he will have to produce it. And I'm only going off of, I heard Assistant Chief Redcorn say that was not offending language to him at all, but he also went on to say the only people that we can direct is the treasurer and himself, so that would be I think that would be a good fix for it. That the treasurer is required to keep that list so he knows when he's authorizing those expenditure funds to come out of the fund that property's on the list.
Congressman Walker.
That works, but I'll go ahead and propose it, and perhaps an amendment to the amendment can be proposed by you.
Okay.
Page 3, line 99 and 100, strike the managed assets department and insert A after the on line 100 and by the treasurer on line 101.
Can you repeat that one more time?
After Congress.
Can the author restate?
Sure. Page 3, line 99 and 100, strike the managed assets department and insert A after the on line 100 and by the treasurer on line 101 after Congress. So it would read, all property serviced by this fund shall be listed on a property inventory document and made available to the Osage Nation Congress by the treasurer.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes. Any further discussion on the committee substitute for ONC in 1950? Assistant Chief Redcorn.
When we start going into detailed, I think before we just said expenses, this and that, if you have a lease in which you take care of the building for the tenant, and that's part of your lease price, you have to have supplies. And there's no provision for supplies, which would be light bulbs and air filters. And that doesn't fall under the definition of regular maintenance. So I would ask if supplies could be added to, I think there's one place in here that has the laundry list of what this can be spent on. That's already an issue for us.
Congresswoman Whitehorn, if you have something on that topic. I had Congressman Walker, I believe, in the queue for another amendment.
I just had a question about that, and that's for the commercial, the property we lease.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, so it would fall under expenditures, that commercial property. Okay, I can do that.
Are you going to work on that?
Yep, that would be very helpful.
Congressman Walker.
So, on that same section, on page 2, section 3E, it says Osage Nation property capital improvements on commercial property and Osage Nation property. Doesn't the title of the bill where it says other expenses for property owned by the Osage Nation?
Congresswoman
We need
White.
to get into that. I mean, that's already defined, is it not? Osage
Congresswoman
Nation
White.
property on page 1C?
Sorry.
Section E specifically addresses expenditures, how the money can be expended out of this fund. I could have broke it down and did, and done commercial property, you could spend this on Osage Nation property on this, and I didn't want to make the bill be so long, so commercial property, from my understanding, they aren't going to want to pay taxes, they aren't going to want to pay insurance, they aren't going to want to pay the things that they have to cover, the expenses they have to cover on our commercial property. No, they're going to, okay, I did say that right. The expenses such as taxes, insurance, what else is there? Taxes, insurance, utilities. Out of this fund, it's proper for them to be able to pay that on our commercial property. Out of nation-owned property, in my view, that's not proper. They shouldn't be paying our utility bill out of this fund. If that limitation, if those designations and expenditures are not made, they would be able to pay, I'm not saying you would, but the law written this way, it's very clear, we're not going to pay insurance, taxes, and utilities on our government-owned property, that those allocations of funds are made in an annual budget. That's why it's written this way.
Congressman Walker.
I think I understand. With that said, shouldn't we insert a period after commercial property about halfway through the paragraph? If not, then when you just stick a comma in there, it confused me.
I have this
Assistant Chief Redcorn.
I have the same set of concerns. I would suggest maybe simpler would just be semicolons to replace all commas. And I'm not at all sure what pre-construction activity applies to as it's listed. I'm confused by that.
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
And when I was going through the overall bill, it did say I left out that definition. I've been working on it really fast, and I know that Mr. Johnson asked for that yesterday to be in this, and so I went ahead and wrote it in because I remembered it, but I didn't go back up and pick up the definition of pre-construction activity, which we have a very good one of in the.
It's not the definition I'm worried about, it's the location in the paragraph, because I'm unsure what it applies to. The way all the other lists up to that point actually make sense if you stick semicolons instead of commas, but where is pre-construction activity allowed? Let me just pose that question.
On all of it. If you're doing capital improvements on both nation-owned property and commercial property, you're going to need to have pre-construction. You're going to have to get architecture and
I'm
engineering.
good, sorry.
Okay.
Congressman Bighorse.
I was just going to try to clarify for Assistant Chief, but I think a light went off for him.
It's slow.
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Do we want to make the amendment for a semicolon, or do we want to ask Mr. Guild just to do it as a Scrivener's error, and I'll make a note right now?
Congressman Walker.
I like a period right there, because that is two different movements, or two different expenditures.
Chair will entertain a motion to amend, either way.
Let me read. if there was a period, it would say expenditures from the fund are authorized for regular maintenance, emergency repairs, utilities, taxes, insurance, advertising on all commercial property, and pre-construction activities, period. Emergency repairs on Osage Nation property, capital improvements on commercial property and Osage Nation property and pre-construction activities. Maybe that doesn't,
It
that
needs
needs,
semicolons right there.
yeah, it does. That's vague on that last part. Whenever it gets vague, once the two are differentiated, that's where it's vague to me.
Well,
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
and it's because emergency repairs are allowed on both nation property and commercial property. So, and that's the only one, I think. I should have done lists. It would have been more clear, but I was just trying to not make the bill be 1.5 miles long. So I think semicolons really do it. I like.
One more question.
Congressman Walker.
And I think you said this earlier, but I still think that we would be okay. What if it just said Osage Nation property? So you're wanting to distinguish between, there's things that we're able to do on Osage Nation property that we're not able to do on commercial property. And you want to distinguish that under
The other way around.
Okay. And you want to distinguish that in that expenditure provision.
Yes.
Congresswoman Stabler.
I was just going to try to clarify that very thing. Oh, you want me to go ahead and clarify it? I thought maybe you got it.
I think I did.
So we have, in other budgets, we have line items and we have departments to take care of the nation property, the tribal properties, the program properties. Maybe that's the program
Space
properties.
cost.
So that's the separation. Commercial properties, we don't have.
Any further discussion? Chair will entertain an amendment.
Well, right now I'm writing one on the one before we discuss, because we're
Take five.
going down the trail really fast.
We can do it on the fly, can't we? So what do you think?
I think we can modify it.
Chair will
Motion
entertain a
to
motion for a 5-minute recess.
adjourn to- Yes, so moved.
There's a motion and a second. Any opposed? Seeing none, we are in recess for 5 minutes.
Okay. Are you going to do the semicolon one?
I'd like to call the Appropriations Committee back to order. We are on discussion regarding a potential amendment. Page 2, Section E. Recognize Congressman Walker for another amendment.
Page 1, line 43, insert after full or fractionated, so that the line will read, property in which the Osage Nation has full or fractionated ownership.
There's an amendment. Is there a second? Second. There's an amendment and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Director Johnson, did you have your hand up? My apologies. Congresswoman Whitehorn.
I'm still going to, I left it out of the committee substitute, and I'm going to oppose it because as it's written, to me, if we have a piece of property that we don't fully own that needs repair, that we don't have full interest in, a special appropriation could be asked for that. As it's written right now, if we owned a office building and we had a half interest in it or a quarter interest in it, it could actually come before this body and we could do $1 million project on it the way this is written. And I just don't think that's appropriate for a piece of property that Osage Nation doesn't have 100% ownership in. So, or if an HVAC would go out on, same said, if an HVAC would go out on that same said piece of property and we just had a quarter interest in that office building, as this bill is written, emergency or contingency funds, we could buy a new HVAC system for that property that we own a very small fraction. We could even just own a 10th interest in it. So I don't think that's appropriate. I think a consideration coming back to Congress for those special events is appropriate.
Got Congressman Walker, Treasurer Littleton, Assistant Chief Redcorn, Congressman Goodfox.
Maybe I can wrap it up with a few questions of my own. So if I can give the latitude of a few questions. How many buildings or structures do we own fractionated interests in? Can anybody answer that? Zero.
Zero, yes, sir.
Zero. Okay. About how many acres of land or property does the Osage Nation own fractionated interests in? Is it in the thousands?
I don't have the numbers, with me, Congressman, and I wouldn't want to throw anything out there.
I will. I think it's in the thousands of acres that we bought with the Cobell settlement money that we own fractionated interests in. So if we put this provision in there, that would prevent us from using the funding for emergency repairs on fences down, ponds breaking, any number of things that the Osage Nation would likely have the resources to take care of. There could be livestock, there could be a structure on one of those pieces of property that it could be a barn, it could be any number of things. So your argument is valid, but I think the argument to allow the fractionated interests outweighs the argument against.
Treasurer Littleton, Assistant Chief Redcorn, Congressman Goodfox, and Director Johnson.
Sound like a roll call.
I know, right?
Well, I would like to concur with Congressman Walker. I think what we're talking about here is basically grazing land that we have fractionated interest on. What I know about that is you don't get every party to participate when you do a cash call, and that can happen in a partnership or fractionated interest. If the nation has an asset at risk or liability risk, and we can't get every other owner to participate, we're probably going to, again, err on conservativeness and spend the money, and maybe at that point we do a lawsuit against owners. I'm stepping way out of the treasurer position, but I think if we don't include those fractionated interests, we could get into a situation where we can't protect the interest of the nation, and then at that case, we'd have to come back and you guys would have to consider it again. So that's my position.
Assistant Chief Redcorn.
Congresswoman Whitehorn, I can tell you that almost anybody who owns a partial interest in a building has an agreement in their partnership or in their corporate papers, which require all partners to participate according to their ownership of that company on any expenditures that are required. So even though that may not be in Osage law, I can promise you any agreement, just everyday people on the street have this in their partnership agreements. And I think that would take care of the scenario that you described, where there's an HVAC need and we pay for all of it. That's just, no one else is going to let their HVAC go, because you're not going to have any tenants if that's the case.
Congressman Goodfox.
Well, I think everyone has said what I would have touched on, and just to add that the people elected a chief and assistant chief to make decisions for that branch of government, and I think that we have some oversight here, but if something comes up and they need to spend some money on something that's fractionated, I think that's their role. They're making a decision that the people put them there to do. They're prioritizing and gonna do what's best for the Osage Nation. So I have trust there. They're gonna do what's best for the Osage Nation and not do anything to harm or to go outside of their authority. So I'm in favor of putting this back in, and it was in the original, so I'd like for it to go back in.
Any further comments on the amendment? Treasurer Littleton.
I'm not an English major by any, but I'm having trouble with the word fractionated. Wouldn't it be fractional? Fractional ownership?
that have
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
been involved with the BIA and the federal government. They call it fractionated interests.
Okay, well,
But I guess we can say fractional if we want to.
well, I was thinking the Fred, I'm sorry.
He's a math guy. Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes.
Supplies.
Oh, we're still waiting on Trey's amendment.
Can somebody step into Mr. Gill's office and see if there is an amendment ready? Do you have any more? Are you sure?
No. Somebody stole my bill. Yeah, let's do that.
Chair will entertain a motion from the committee.
Motion to table. ONCA 1950.
There's a
Follow
motion
the
to
chair.
table ONCA 1950, the call of the chair. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion to table ONCA 1950. And there is a
call of the
second
chair.
to the call of the chair. There's a second from Congresswoman Whitehorn. All those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Opposed, seeing none. ONCA 1950 is on the table. Now move on to consideration of ONCA 1949. Congresswoman Good Fox, you have the floor.
What is that, the 400?
Yes.
Okay, well, we've gone over this, have we not?
We
We have, you all know, does anyone have any questions? You know where the money's coming from.
Congresswoman Whitehorn?
We need a budget. We don't have a budget for this.
Well, okay.
Congresswoman Good Fox.
I guess postpone it and then I'll work with executive to get a budget.
But I didn't understand the delay.
The point was raised that there's not a budget to accompany ONCA 1949.
I think you have been provided with this document, have you not?
Can we see it?
Pardon?
That's not a budget.
Because that's
Okay.
Director Johnson.
Can we get a budget?
Yes, sir. I'm aware of what's needed.
All right.
I'll talk to the deputy here
Chair will entertain a
right
motion
after
to
this. We'll have one
table ONCA 1949.
pretty quick.
Congressman Walker.
Are there other amendments that we're going to consider regarding this bill? If there are, we're here, the sponsor is here. Maybe we could tackle some of that.
There was something.
I mean, I don't have any amendments prepared, but
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
I don't have a budget doc. As far as I know, what we got in support documents were a packet on the Heritage Center that had no cost estimates. In fact, it indicated that Wallace Engineering said that this, my reading of it said, this structure's it's gonna be more expensive. It's gonna be very expensive to fix this and get it right. Basically is what the engineering company says. We don't have I'm not opposed to fixing it, but we don't have the information of how much it's gonna cost. Have you guys put it out for cost estimates or anything? I haven't seen that document.
Director Johnson.
Yes, ma'am. What you're referencing is to make the second floor usable for, humans. It includes making it ADA accessible with an elevator and, all of that type of stuff. The $205,000 is to shore up the structure so that the building doesn't fall down. It doesn't make the second floor usable. It keeps, what it does is it keeps the roof from going to the floor. So it is much, it costs a whole lot less to keep the building intact as opposed to getting it to where you can actually let human beings walk around, have, desks and computers and everything else on that second story. So what that $205,000 does is it keeps the building standing safely, but doesn't allow for occupancy of the second floor.
Congressman Big Horse.
I don't recall what communication it was, but I do recall the communication that referenced the $205,000 for the roof to the Heritage Building. I apologize for not knowing what the communication number was, but I do recall seeing it and reading it.
Congressman Whitehorn.
You're right, Congressman Big Horse. I read the number $205,000 also, but I don't know that it said it was for a roof repair. I saw it in an email chain. How much is this going to cost? It says $205,000, but I don't know what this is. And I do know because you're telling me at the table. My point is, I think we need to fix the building. We don't have a budget that tells what the remainder of the fund's going to do. Is that going to be for electric bills on our commercial property between now and then? That's the kind of document I think is appropriate to have over here.
Director Johnson.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I know exactly what you're talking about. And just to clear things up, that number that you and Congressman Big Horse are referring to was in an email string. It involved the entire, hey, we want to make this to where we can live and hang out on the second floor and all those things, and it was exorbitant. Like you said, it would actually be cheaper to tear the whole thing down and build a new one. So in that, the discussion became, okay, well, how do we make the building safe? Do X, Y, and Z. Okay, how much will that cost? $205,000. So that's where all of that came from. And I believe, don't hold me to this, but I believe that email string got sent with the supporting docs. I'm not 100% sure.
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Yes, we have it, but I don't know that it designates what $205,000 was for. I realize you were talking about the Heritage Center. So that's all I know about it. Yeah, I agree we had that number.
Assistant Chief Redcorn.
Well, I've reviewed this document here, which is the matrix, and it does detail out exactly what is designed to come out of each of these funds, what it's for. Are you asking for a construction budget for the whole $205,000? I'm just clarifying what we're being asked to provide.
Just a budget for the fund. Where are you going to appropriate that money?
Well, the 200, I'll tell you, the 205,000 is going to the Heritage Center. The 50,000 is going for A&E on the Building A expansion in Tulsa, and there's $200,000 left over. And as we talked about yesterday, that's going to be used for the purposes designed in the bill. And then we will be providing on July 15th a budget for 2020, because what the bill requires is an annual budget. We've got a part of a year left, so that's what we're asking for. If that's not going to happen, there's a lot of things that are going to come to a screeching halt.
Got Director Johnson, then Congresswoman Whitehorn.
I'm pretty positive I understand what's being asked. As part of the support documentation for this legislation, Congress would like to see, Jody, the normal budget like we do, tribal dollars, 455, everything else blank till you get down here to the bottom and says Heritage Center structural,
Right.
shoring or whatever you want to call it, $205,000. architect and engineering for this $50,000 and then just put 200,000 in emergency repairs line item, and then is that, am I right?
That would be great.
Okay.
And if I may,
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
the document that you're referring to, I don't believe we have a copy. I really don't think we have a copy of that, do we? Right now? Okay, when did we receive
you
that? Did it come in
emailed
the
it
original
2 days
support
ago.
documents? Okay. Excuse me? Pardon me?
Congressman Walker.
I realize we don't have the budget, but that's not going to result in an amendment to this bill, is it?
No, and I didn't say I would want to amend it. I just said we didn't have a budget for it. To discuss, for discussion, to know what $450,000 request was. I realize now I have a document that I didn't know I had. But my
Chair will-
computer's dead.
Chair will entertain movement on ONC 1949. If no other further discussion. Congressman Walker.
Motion to report out ONCA 1949 to Congress as amended with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
There's a motion, a second. Any discussion?
We don't have a quorum. No, yeah, we do.
Any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion passes. At this time, Chair will entertain a motion to revisit ONCA 1950.
So moved.
There's a motion and a second.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any opposed? Seeing none, we're now on consideration of ONCA 1950. Congresswoman Whitehorn, you are recognized for an amendment.
Page 1, line 45, insert the following new definition. D, pre-construction activities means site selection, site development. I'm going to have to strike some words there. Let me ask a question first. Mr. Johnson, do you need, for capital improvements on existing property, do we need site development, site evaluation? Probably site evaluation. Site selection, we don't need though, right? I'm sorry, do you have a copy of this amendment? No. Do you have a?
I've got several now.
Okay.
My apologies.
Pre-construction activity, this is going into this capital improvement, property improvement fund. Do we need site selection and site development as pre-construction activity in this definition?
Got Director Johnson, then Congressman Walker, then Assistant Chief Redcorn.
Ma'am, I think it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
I'm with him.
Okay.
Congressman Walker.
Definitely. The truth of the matter, pre-construction activities, if we get right down to it, we could keep going and going and going. Mm-hmm. Truthfully. So I'm just a little bit hesitant to get so specific within the definition of pre-construction activities.
Assistant Chief Redcorn, then Congressman Whitehorn.
Includes but is not limited to. I'm just trying to
I think that would be a good idea.
suggest something everybody can live with.
Congressman Whitehorn.
Well, I'm going to just go with what it is, but I understand what you're saying. Trying to see where includes pre-construction activities and means includes but not limited. Where does that belong in a definition? That was what I'm trying to figure out here. And other
Anywhere.
activities.
Anywhere in that paragraph. It's pre-construction activities, you have a list, it's in the amendment, add it to the amendment, And if there's not any other,
I'm just trying to see where in the definition it really belongs.
oh, in the
Yes, in the.
oh, in the
actual-
definitions,
in
I'm
the
sorry. I
actual-
misunderstood.
Yes, I'm trying to see where it should.
My apologies.
Go there, and feasibility studies. I think I'm gonna strike the "and" there and and put "or such activities" at the end of it, or such activities. How does that sound to you?
It includes, or are you going to put the includes, but it's not limited to?
I don't see that it belongs at the first of the definition. I was gonna put on the end of feasibility, I was gonna strike the "and" before feasibility, put a comma, and put "or such activities." To me, that kind of opens up the door.
Or such activities necessary for project development.
Okay. Thank you, RJ. I like that. For project development?
Yes. Well, there's no schedule in there, there's no estimate in there.
Okay.
There's a
Can you
cost
withdraw and
estimate.
restate your motion?
I don't think I got a second on it or anything. Can I just start?
Okay.
Okay.
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Page 1, line 45, insert the following new definition. D, pre-construction activities means site selection, site development, site evaluation, conceptual design, programming, planning or cost analysis, design survey, soil test, cost estimate, and feasibility studies or such activities for project development, period. That's Amendment 1.
Second.
There's an amendment and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes. Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Amendment 2, page 2, lines 71 through 75, strike lines 71 through 75, and insert the following new paragraphs. E, commercial property expenditures from the fund are authorized for regular maintenance, emergency repairs, supplies, utilities, taxes, insurance, advertising, capital improvements, and pre-construction activity. F, period, Osage Nation property expenditures from the fund are authorized for emergency repairs, capital improvement, and pre-construction activity.
There's a motion. Is there a second? Motion and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Congressman Walker.
I'm just throwing this out there. What if we put a similar clause in case we miss something, or other expenditures necessary for maintaining commercial property, Osage Nation commercial property?
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
I think I would have remained with the original bill if that's what we're going to do. I wouldn't have done all this work.
Okay, well, we've made some good amendments.
I think so.
Any further discussion on the amendment?
No?
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes. Chair will entertain a motion regarding ONCA 1950. Congressman Walker.
Move to report bill number ONCA 1950 as a committee substitute, as amended to Congress with the due pass recommendation.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Congresswoman Whitehorn with a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, ONCA 1950 is reported to Congress as a committee substitute with amendments with the due pass recommendation. I believe so, Congressman Goodfox. At this time, we'll move on to consideration of ONCA 1948. Congressman Walker, you are the author. I will say that just for time purposes, this is kind of where I was hoping we would get to. It's my understanding ONCA 1948 can be replaced by any of the four bills that were added to our agenda this afternoon. So if you're okay with it at this time, the chair will entertain a motion to object to the consideration of ONCA 1948. That way it dispenses with it off of our agenda. It's voted on, we're dealt with.
So moved.
There's a motion.
Objection.
There's a motion to object to the consideration of ONCA 1948. Is there a second?
The motion is to object.
Object to the consideration. That way we're voting on it to not have to consider it at all. Chair will entertain a motion for a very brief recess.
Well,
Chair will entertain a motion for a very brief recess.
So moved.
There's a motion and a second. No objection, we are in recess.
I believe.
Okay. I'd like to call the Appropriations Committee meeting back to order. After brief discussion,
Might need to get people's attention.
after a brief discussion with Legislative Counsel, I would ask that the
We need order.
previous motion, if we can have order. Thank you. Chair would ask that the previous motion be withdrawn.
so move.
Motion and a second, or without objection, the motion is withdrawn. This time, the chair would entertain a motion to report to the Congress the do not pass recommendation, ONCA 1948.
So move.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. Congressman Walker.
So with that said, it's going to have to be voted on. I can't withdraw it on the floor.
You can withdraw it on the floor, but that will take a vote of Congress to do that. So reporting it with a do not pass recommendation with the aye withdrawing it will satisfy the requirements in Osage law regarding the special session.
So does the motion need to be amended to say with an aye? Okay. No more discussion.
Any further discussion?
I thought you said.
We are on number 9. But we still have to vote on it, then we'll be done with it. I think they're just trying to straighten out how they're going to record it.
I'm going to die a peaceful death.
You good? All right. Any further discussion
Those other two, if
on the
we're
motion
ready.
to report to Congress with the do not pass recommendation? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, ONCA 1948 is reported to Congress with a do not pass recommendation. This time, we are set to move on to item number 10 and 11, ONCA 1947 and ONCA 1946. I would request that the author yield at this time to work our way through items number 13 through 16 on the agenda, two of which are the author's bills. Congressman Walker.
Okay, we're going to have to get to all of them anyway. I don't see that we're going to make it through those 4 bills, and I think there's a chance we can get through these other two and get them off of our table. I don't feel, I mean, I'm not going to have an issue or cause a stink over it. I was just curious.
We'll move on to consideration of ONCA 1947.
1947. I'm ready for 1946. Get your yard mowed?
I know, I just went home and said I need to give to people.
It's camp assets. That's new camp assets.
Congressman Walker, you are recognized for ONCA 1947. I do have questions from Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Let's do.
Congresswoman Whitehorn, you are recognized.
I'm willing to work on whatever bill we want to right now, but I know for sure that we can get that museum. Are you ready for your museum bill? I know for sure we can get
Yes.
that off the table.
That's what I was.
And I would prefer,
I've already got an amendment prepared for it.
the other one has several amendments to make to it, and I don't know that we can get it off the table in the time allotted.
Chair will entertain a motion to postpone consideration of ONCA 1947.
So moved.
Second.
There's
How
a
about it?
motion and a second. Congressman Walker.
Just in case, should we just table it to the call of the chair? If we postpone it, then can't be heard again today.
True.
And if we don't get to it, then it remains on the table.
I don't know that we're going to get to, I don't know that we're going to get back to it. Either way,
Motion to postpone ONCA 1947.
there's a previous motion on the table.
Withdraw.
The motion is withdrawn. Congressman Walker.
Motion to postpone ONCA 1947 to the call of the chair.
Second.
That's what we, there's a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Table. You forgot to say table.
No, we're going to postpone. We're not going to hear it today.
Okay. So that was one was there.
There's a motion to postpone made by Congressman Walker with a second from Congresswoman Whitehorn. Any further discussion on a motion to postpone? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, consideration of ONCA 1947 is postponed. We'll now move on to consideration of ONCA 1946. Congressman Walker, you are recognized.
Okay, so 1946 is an appropriation of $300,000 to the Capital Asset Fund for conceptual design for the Osage Nation Museum expansion. We have considered this during this special session during committee already once, maybe twice. There's been discussions around the table on how we're going to handle this. I think I expressed on the air that whenever I filed the bill, I did express to the executive branch that I would be proposing an amendment to have the appropriation come out of the existing museum fund that currently has $275,000 and change in it. There are limitations within the museum fund that limit the uses of that fund, and they would not allow for the dollars in that fund to be used for the conceptual design. Kind of rehashing just a little bit, the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, David Gran, has been here. He likes what he sees. He's asked us if there's any, or asked the chief and others what we had planned for the museum, if there were any expansion opportunities or plans being explored. And the answer was yes, kind of, but nothing necessarily in the work. We don't really have anything in hand to show you. So that led to what I would consider a kind of an expedited effort to get a conceptual on the table. So that's why I agreed to sponsor the bill. The bill as written, as filed, would count against the yet to be, but likely to be, revised projected revenue for this year. So it would come out of the general fund essentially, or if it does come out that way, that $300,000 would not go into the general fund. So I have an amendment to strike the $300,000 and insert $250,000. And also another amendment that would strike commercial property fund and insert museum fund. Again, explaining that, I know I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm trying to wrap all of this up in one big confusing description. But if both of those amendments passed, then the $250,000 would come out of funds that have already been appropriated, and it would benefit the funds available for appropriations for the remainder of this fiscal year by $250,000.
Assistant Chief Redcorn.
The executive branch supports the concepts expressed and described by Congressman Walker.
Congresswoman Whitehorn.
I'll second your motion your amendment if you'll assert it.
Congressman Walker.
Amendment 1, page 1, lines 16, 25, 29, and 30, strike $300,000 and its parenthetical equivalent, insert $250,000 in its parenthetical equivalent.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes. Congressman Walker.
Amendment 2, page 1, lines 25, 30, and 31, strike commercial property fund and insert museum fund.
Second.
There's a motion and there is a second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the amendment passes. Congressman Horn, you are recognized.
I'm ready to move this legislation out if there's no opposition to doing so. Move to report ONCA 1946 to Congress as amended with a due pass recommendation.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Seeing none, ONCA 1946 is reported to Congress with a due pass recommendation as amended.
Thank you.
This time, we can go back to consideration of ONCA 1947, or we can start consideration of 1955, 56, 57, and 58.
Postponed.
Calling it back up.
By motion?
We've postponed it, so we would have to have a motion to reconsider it, or motion to consider it. Congresswoman Stabler.
You mentioned 1947. We already did 1947. That's a duplication, unless there's something I don't know about.
1947 does appear as item number 10 and number 12 on our agendas. So we're not recognizing that one of them is on there.
Okay.
1947 was postponed to the call of the chair.
Yes.
So I would recommend a motion to consider 1947. It was postponed, so it would take a motion to be able to consider it.
Okay.
Congressman Walker.
I think the heavy lifting that we have left on our table is the bills that were read in by you and I earlier today. I think we would benefit ourselves if we would at least spend the next 15 or 20 minutes while we have the treasurer and assistant chief at the table, if we can open up some dialogue that we can maybe start seeing some common ground and work towards something that we can agree on tomorrow. That's
Happy
just,
to go wherever the committee would like to go. We can start discussion on ONCA 1955, 56, 57, and 58, or we can entertain a motion to go back and consider ONCA 1947. I would agree that I think some discussion needs to start on 55, 56, 57, 58. That's where I would prefer to go, but okay. Start consideration of ONCA 1955. Congressman Walker, you have the floor.
ONCA 1955?
Yes.
okay. So Chairman Potts, I don't have, it's not going to be on a tracker because they were advanced to first reading this morning. Which bill is yours that we discussed during lunch? Is that 50?
ONCA 1957.
So your bill has a lot more in it. And I think it accomplishes more that we really are all hoping to get to. And I mentioned to you earlier that I would consider working on your bill and even co-sponsoring your bill and letting my bill, the bill that's, I want to call it competing bill, the bill that I filed that does some of what yours does, a few different things, and
I'll recognize Assistant Chief, and then I can answer that as well.
Well, I'll let him finish. I just want to be next in line.
I think we would be more beneficial by working on your bill right now.
Assistant Chief.
The executive branch stands ready to work on 57. There are some very specific amendments we would hope to get put in it to make it acceptable to us. And we can talk about those if you want to use this time to do so.
Thank you, Assistant Chief. I would agree that ONC 1957 and 1958 are competing in nature, not hostile in any way, but they are competing in nature to 55 and 56. However, in light of needing to disperse with the items, in consideration of 1955, Chair would entertain a motion to report to Congress with a do not pass recommendation. Congressman Walker.
Motion to modify the agenda and, well, I don't know if I'm prepared to do that just yet, Chairman.
Okay.
Motion to modify the agenda and move to
We can just,
agenda item.
I'll move to consideration of ONC 1950.
Okay.
We don't need to do that by motion. Now move on to consideration of ONC 1957. Okay, I'll turn the chair over to Vice Chair Walker for consideration of ONCA 1957.
Okay, where's an agenda? Can I see the agenda? Found it. Agenda item 15 is consideration of ONCA 1957, an act to amend 15 ONC section 1A-101, 1A-104, 1A-105, 1A-108, and 1A-109 to insert new sections at 15 ONC sections 1A-112 through 1A-115 and to establish an alternate effective date. The sponsor is Congressman Potts. Congressman Potts, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill is a first attempt to try to tackle the issue that has been at this table for quite a while regarding non-tribal revenue. There are amendments in 15-1A-101 to remove references to non-tribal revenue being included in projected revenue. There's cleanup language, apologies, in 15-1A-104 regarding some of the definitions and regarding tribal funding. There are amendments in 15-1A-105, again, doing the same thing regarding tribal funding and throughout. The new sections of law that would be created starts, I believe, at section 6. 1A-112 is the authorization to expend non-tribal funds. It would read the Osage Nation executive, judicial, and legislative branches in coordination with the Osage Nation treasurer are hereby authorized to expend non-tribal funds received by the respective branch in accordance with the agreements executed by the principal chief on behalf of the Osage Nation and for the benefit thereof. Non-tribal funds that require a tribal funding match shall not be accepted until the tribal funding match has been appropriated. The additional language is 1A-113 with a requirement to report.
I need to know where you are. What line?
It's line 221 on page 5. The requirement to report that the treasurer shall report all grants awarding non-tribal funds to the clerk of the Osage Nation Congress within 10 days of receipt. Treasurer shall provide a monthly accounting of expenditures for non-tribal funds to the Osage Nation Congress. Section C and D are capturing what was previous language in 15 ONC section 2201, 2202, 2203, and 2204. This is the language or the section of law that previously stated that no money may be spent without an appropriation of Congress. The companion bill, in my opinion, that goes with this is ONC 1958. 1958 repeals the language contained in a different section of code 1957 captures that language and places it at the end of budgetary law. So it's placing all budgetary law that we know of, or that I know of, in one place. We've always pointed to these two places in code. This captures it and puts it in one place. So then the result is 15.1A, 114, and 115. 114 is simply definitions. 115 is regarding the same provision that existed in 15.2.201 through 2.204. Reading, no tribal funds shall be drawn from the treasury of the Osage Nation except by appropriation in accordance with the Constitution and Osage Nation law. B is all expenditures of tribal funds from the Osage Nation must be in strict accordance with the appropriation and laws of the Osage Nation. C, any person who violates this act by expending tribal funds without appropriation or by directing another to expend the tribal funds without an appropriation shall be subject to a criminal fine, etc. It reads on. Section 7 is an alternate effective date. It's the presentation of the bill. Again, there's a lot here. Apologize for not being able to get it out earlier, but it's before us now, and open the floor for questions. You're the chair.
I'm the chair. Sleep at the wheel. Congresswoman Whitehorn.
So this is the first, I just now opened this up on my computer. It's the first time I've had the opportunity to look at it. So, and you went pretty fast on the first. I followed you. I caught up with you at the very end. So does this just leave out the reference of federal funds? Would you please tell me where the language, give me the line number where it actually addresses federal funds? Because
there's a lot, and Legislative Council may be able to assist with that process a little bit better because I've read it so many times now that it's starting to be the same as it used to be. Essentially what it does, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gill, essentially what it does is, yes, remove the reference to including non-tribal funds in projected revenue.
okay.
Additionally, anywhere where we're required Congress to approve projected revenue, it then lines out tribal projected revenue, at which point you need to redefine what your funding sources are. So funding sources is now defined as any tribal revenue and any restricted revenue, excluding non-tribal revenue. So it's left out. So what has been the practice of the Congress the last couple of years is including tribal, non-tribal, and restricted revenue in projected revenue. Amendments throughout this section, I don't know where they all are. I can go look for them and highlight them if you need. But throughout this section, it removes the reference to non-tribal funds. So it directs others and ourselves to only include tribal and restricted revenue for projected revenue, and then limits us to still not exceeding projected revenue, but the annual budget will not exceed those, which only include tribal and restricted revenues. So, for instance, number 1 means the total annual appropriation of all tribal expenditures for a given fiscal year. That used to read all revenue from all funding sources, I believe.
Okay.
So it's those types of changes throughout these definitions.
Sorry.
Can you please get a microphone?
Oh,
The definition of annual budget was also changed, so non-tribal funds are no longer considered. That way, annual budget and projected revenue meet up as they're supposed to in the Constitution.
Okay.
To further elaborate, and I know Assistant Chief wanted to be recognized, but the example is annual projected revenue report means a written report prepared from time to time by the Appropriations Committee, which itemizes estimated projected revenues of the nation by tribal funding source for a specific fiscal year. Further down, we redefine tribal funding sources as tribal revenue and restricted revenue. So that all gets married together in there. I'm somewhat happy about it.
Assistant Chief.
The treasurer and I have both given this a pretty good pass. I'm going to let the treasurer speak to one part. I'm going to speak to another. We feel strongly, oh, that's good, that section 108 just needs clarification. We're not trying to take away any of the limitations that Congress has or is placing on what the treasurer can do in terms of budget mods. We are trying to take any confusion out of that section. And all we've done is rearrange the parts to do so and eliminated and concentrating on exactly what the header says. The header talks about the treasurer's authorities and limitations. So that's all we want to talk about. We don't need to talk about budget amendments at all in that section to talk about the treasurer's authorities and limitations. So we've discussed this with Congressman Walker. We have some suggested cleanup for that we hope meets the pleasure of the Congress, because this is really important to us. If the idea isn't, you have that? If the idea is to not come in here unnecessarily. Secondly, I'm going to let the treasurer speak to the definitions. This isn't in your bill, but the definitions of budget modification and budget amendment, I'm brain dead too, need to be examined. They're very brief, and we feel like that increase and decrease language, actually all the descriptors that kind of make it required that one of these things exists for there to be a need for a budget amendment, is another thing that causes us to call Congress into session, perhaps unnecessarily if it wasn't there. So I'm reserving the right to keep looking at this. Like I said, we took a really good pass, but those are the two places that are, we're giving you a conditional green light on this, but these are two things we really think, and honestly, we're trying to help Congress do what I think it's trying to do, which is not come in unnecessarily by doing so. It's not to give us any more flexibility than we already have. It's just not wanting to come in. And I would ask that the treasurer be allowed to elaborate on that.
Treasurer Littleton?
And without trying to overstep my authority or my invite to the table here, I would like to make a couple of suggestions that I think would clarify a lot of the issues that I've dealt with. If I could suggest a little bit of verbiage that I think should be added. I'm not going to say this is the best verbiage. You guys write law, so hopefully you'll be able to understand what I'm trying to convey and put it in a term that I can understand. How about that? And really what that has to do with are the two budget amendment, budget modification definitions, and I pulled those, and I'm sure you all have those memorized, but from my understanding of comments and interpretations of what I'm hearing from this body and the complete body is that a budget amendment increases or decreases the bottom line of a budget. So, and if that's an oversimplification, I understand you'll correct me. But I've also heard that you don't really want me to come back to you if it's a decrease. So my suggestion to the definition of a budget amendment would be to add the phrase, or excuse me, maybe strike the word decrease and add the phrase to the bottom line of the budget. And I see wheels turning. So let me go to the next one. A budget modification, my understanding there is that that's something that you feel like we ought to be able to handle without aggravating you. That's probably a poor term. Maybe addressing you is a better term. If it doesn't affect the bottom line. So on the definition of budget modification, if we could add there some way does not change budget bottom line. I think those are fairly simple, but in my simple mind, those would have eliminated a lot of the pieces of paper that you guys had to read and we had to submit. So, and again, those are suggestions that I would have at this point.
Who wants to address that? I've got a comment, Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Well, on the first, I think you, on the budget amendment, you wanted the word decrease out of that definition, correct?
I understood that I was directed, I understood that if a budget was decreased, you didn't necessarily want to consider it in this body.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things today, but one thing we can't do is unappropriate money. So when you come back for a budget modification, if you're moving $19,000 from one budget into another budget, it's going to decrease that budget, and that's appropriate because you're going to move it, you're pulling it out and you're moving it over here. So I don't know, I'm trying to think of how that, if that was taken out to exclude the word decrease, if that would really be in the spirit of that definition. That was just my first thought on that.
And if I'm okay to reply, that was my argument too. But again, I understood that if we realized we weren't going to spend the money in one budget, you didn't feel like we needed to come back and give you a budget amendment.
Congresswoman Stabler.
That's true. That's exactly what we said. If it decreases, you fall under the appropriation, so you're safe to not have to bring it back for an amendment. And without, we're looking for the verbiage now, but without, I guess we need to, for me, I need to look at the bills specifically because there are certain requirements if it touches certain line items. So if it does decrease, but it touches certain line items, you do have to bring it back here. So I don't know what the hesitancy is on the decrease in general. If somebody can give me an argument why we wouldn't want to take that out.
Congressman Potts.
With an eye toward time, perhaps if you could submit those in writing, or those proposals in writing, that would be helpful to process and work through. My immediate hesitation is over the consideration of how these budgets are interpreted by the executive branch versus what Congress believes. In that we believe our appropriation bill is by section, and that's what's to be implemented. So if the language and the definitions were to change, and maybe an unintended consequence could be that budgets or money could be shifted from one section to another section, the bottom line would not have changed. That would not need to come back to Congress. And I don't know that I'm ready to do that, because at this point, we appropriate for those specific departments, and that's how the Congress intends for those monies to be spent. So I don't know that I'm ready to go there, and I would like to flesh that out more in reading it.
I'm going to make a comment, and it's been a long day and a lot of, anyway, I may say something a bit ignorant, getting the difference between amendments and modifications. Is what I'm thinking, though, when I hear this discussion is amendments don't necessarily, if we put to the bottom line, don't we need an exception of into or out of salaries, wages, and fringe? Because they don't always, I would say more times than not, they don't change the bottom line. Or, well, they do or they don't. They don't, right?
Right, they don't.
So, yeah, so if we put to the bottom line, there would have to be an exception in there. So, and those protections still are in this bill, restricting into or out of salaries, wages, and fringe, along with direct services.
Which I'm not addressing.
Assistant Chief?
So, a couple of things. Number one, Congressman Potts, am I understanding you to say that there is no interprogrammable transfer of funds allowed under current law? Because if that's true, we're going to be here a lot, I think. I would also say that the Supreme Court has said very clearly that appropriation amount constantly in their ruling means the bottom line of a branch budget. They've made that abundantly clear, and there's no other interpretation of that I can come to. So I think I'm mentioning this now not to prolong the conversation. I'm mentioning this because I think all of these types of concepts need to be rolled around and thought about before we end up back here again.
Okay, so, Mr. Johnson, it's 3:02. Gonna allow you a parting shot, and then if Congressman Potts has anything that he would like to say to end the meeting, but after that, we're gonna have to. I have one. Anyway, we got started on it. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. And the Assistant Chief is correct. It's on page 29 of Standing Bear v. Pratt slip opinion that a budget or an appropriation for a budget is to a branch, and it is very specific. It's italicized. It's footnoted. It's got in parentheses for emphasis. Additionally, ONCA 1940 describes that Congress makes an appropriation to a branch, an instrumentality, or an individual entity. So those three things are what get appropriated into, not managed assets, not Bird Creek Farm, not the language department or the museum, into a branch. And so that's where a lot of our disagreements are coming from. So, and again, we're trying to abide by all of those things. And so I don't, as the guy that has to, manage the day-to-day operations, it becomes extremely difficult trying to balance what the court said, what the law says, and then, what Congress is saying. And so we get things like this. To me, and again, I'll go back to, I look at things as simple as I can look at them. If indeed there is a budget for the executive branch of the Osage Nation, and for whatever reason, act of God, whatever, money needs to be moved from here to here, as long as this number, this appropriated number here at the top doesn't change up or down, I'm just not seeing the issue.
I'll yield my time to Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Okay, Congresswoman Whitehorn.
Well, there's two things I want to talk about. We got into a really big subject, but Treasurer Littleton was asking about those definitions. I just want to put it out here for us to consider. Budget amendment. This body doesn't amend budgets. This body amends appropriation bills. So maybe retitling that an appropriation amendment would lessen your heartburn, so let's think about that. And Mr. Johnson, when we look at our appropriation bills that are drafted, and you're talking about the big number that's up there that says that's appropriated to the executive branch, that's the title of the bill. What falls underneath that is the legislative portions of the executive branch budgets, which you guys have every ability to gather up. You guys are doing it right now and send to us in the form that you request. So that's my view on it. And the appropriation does go to the executive branch because all of those budgets that you send to us are seated in the executive branch. And I do believe that this body has the ability to write law that governs how the appropriations of the nation are made and budgeting. I believe the Supreme Court clearly gives the legislative branch, Congress, that constitutional authority to do that. So that big number you see in the top, that's the title. It's not the appropriation. The appropriations are down through the rest of the body of the bill, in my view.
All right. I'd say that's a start. Chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion to adjourn, seconded. Without objection, we are adjourned.
So would a